Good afternoon, everybody on the East Coast. Uh, Good morning, everybody everywhere else. This is Paul Nathanson. I'm with the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell, and welcome to our Washington update, where we talk about what's happening with the Congress and with the federal government on issues that impact PMA and NTMA members and manufacturers. I'm here today with my colleagues Omar Nashashibi and John Guzik from the Franklin Partnership. Caitlin Sickles won't be joining us today, but as you know, the Franklin Partnership is your government relations team entity of the One Voice team, and the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell is the strategic communications arm where we work hand in hand to advocate for NTMA, PMA, and all manufacturing issues. So we're happy to be here today and to give you a update on what's happening in Washington. Today we're going to talk about what's happening with Congress now that it is finally forming committees and getting their act together after a dramatic speaker's race, and they've taken some time to organize themselves, but with a new Republican majority, although slight, in the House, there's a lot of things to talk about regarding how Congress has organized itself and what it's going to be tackling in the coming weeks and months, particularly after the State of the Union. And then we're going to talk a little bit on the latest on taxes and regulations. And as always, what's happening on the trade front regarding steel tariffs, 301 tariffs on China, and also supply chain initiatives and challenges that you are all facing. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John, who's going to start with the most descriptive name of a House committee that I've seen in a long time. John, so take it away.
Yes, this is the Select House Committee on the Chinese Communist Party. During the last campaign, Speaker McCarthy, then Leader McCarthy, talked about establishing a China Competition Committee, and that's exactly what he did. The committee is finally up and running. Here's its website. It's chaired by a friend of ours, Congressman Mike Gallagher from Wisconsin, and he's truly trying to make this a bipartisan committee. I got to tell you, there's nothing that brings Congress together is shooting down balloons. That really brought some bipartisanship, and I think we're going to see more of that through this China committee. This is a committee it's not a legislative committee, so we're not going to see them passing legislation, but it's going to be more supporting the standing committees and promoting some of the issues that they are studying and passing moving forward. There is, as well, there's a number of friends that we have who are been selected as members of the committee. As I said, there's Congressman Gallagher from Wisconsin. We've got Kathy Castor from Florida, Roy Sweatman's member of Congress. We've got Haley Stevens, Jeff Asnavorian's member of Congress on the committee. And then the Republicans signed Blaine Luetmeyer from Missouri, John Molinar from Michigan, Darren LaHood from Illinois. So One Voice is well positioned with this committee, with activities that they're doing. And we've already begun our outreach to introduce ourselves to the new committee staff who are just being named and as they put this committee together. Yep. So Omar, in addition, there's, as we've always talked about, workforce issues are bipartisan. There's a big bill dropped this week, a bipartisan workforce bill.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in the workplace space over on Capitol Hill. Typically this time of year, as we get closer to February and March, we do begin to get some notices from lawmakers that they are looking forward to trying to do something with the workforce space. So we do have the bipartisan legislation that we have supported in the past. Over in the Senate has now been introduced, is what we always refer to as the Jobs Act, effectively allowing for Pell Grants for short-term workforce education programs, specifically those that are going to be industry recognized credentials or certificates, which is exactly what both our organizations have been pushing for some time. This really came about around the 2015 timeline when we were saying we need workers now, and some of these 16-week programs just aren't going to be able to work out to meet our needs. So this is bipartisan. It typically just needs a vehicle. That's been our issue for the last several years. It's not so much challenges with the bill itself. It's that there are so many other unrelated issues that are of interest and of concern. We do know that over on the House side, there is a different legislation that they've introduced for Republicans with regards to also Pell Grants, and that also would have some additional strings put on there that are a bit more strict than the Bipartisan Jobs Act that's in there. We were in a meeting 2 days ago on Wednesday morning with some folks that do the actual legislating up on Capitol Hill from the House Education Committee, and they do want to see something move forward in the workforce space, potentially starting to get something together. Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act renewal needs to happen possibly this year. What they're in the process of now, and for those of you that are involved in the workplace space, if you're on a workforce investment board or any of those types of activities, please reach out to myself or John or someone at NTMA and PMA. House committee staff wants to hear from us about the WIOA programs that are working and which ones are not working as they look at reauthorizations, which are those that are being used most by manufacturers and what ones can be tightened up and tweaked a little bit as they look forward to the reauth side of that moving forward, possibly over the summer. So that's something to note as well. But John, right now our top priority is on taxes. As you all know, we still have the R&D full expensing not in effect. You've got to capitalize it and amortize it. So John, it really makes a difference when they hear from you on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, we're banging this drum again, and we have issued a number of action alerts to the One Voice members, urging them to contact their senators and members of Congress, urging them to reauthorize the R&D tax credit, have the expensing immediate. And we thank those who have already completed that the action alert, and urge those who haven't, click on the link. It's easy. The letter's already prepared, it makes a difference to the senators and members of Congress, because this in the end is a numbers game. The R&D extension of the R&D tax credit is a bipartisan issue. But again, as we were talking about, as Omar was talking about earlier on workforce issues, it's what is the vehicle? What is that tax vehicle that the R&D tax credit is going to ride on? There's several scenarios out there. Congress can do nothing. And it goes back, you know, the R&D tax credit expired in January of 2022.
Sorry, 1 second. We just got to clarify because it's different sections. So under 48, you got the credit it's still in effect. So you can still claim the tax credit. It's the 174 full expensing that's separate right now because there is some issues that are out there right now with regards to enforcement. It is the law, no matter whether or not you're claiming the R&D tax credit, you are required to capitalize and at least capitalize those research and development activities. So there are two separate provisions that you need to be cognizant of, that even if you've got your traditional R&D tax credit activities under that traditional section, that's still there. It's now what you've got to deal with is that section 174 is when you got rid of the 100% full immediate expensing for your R&D activities. They replaced it under that section 174 with the requirement that regardless of whether or not you're going to claim the credit, and if you're conducting any of those significant R&D activities, then you are going to have to capitalize those. And that's why they're going to end up in a different place now on your P&L. And you're going to have to recognize that in terms of your 2022 numbers, you're going to have to go back and take a look at what were your actual R&D. So let's say you're going to go in your R&Ds, the way that your amortization is done in year one, it's going to be 10%. So you're going to be looking at your total activities, and then you're going to take off 10%. So let's say you had $1 million or so, you lop off the 10% on that for your amortization for year one. What's left on that, your 900,000, is your tax liability that you've got to make sure is capitalized and you've got to look at. So this is something you really need to be talking to your CPA on, and that's why what John said is so important in terms of what is that vehicle. How can they potentially make this fix this issue? And they would have to do it retroactively. And the further we get beyond March 31st, the more difficult it is to address section 174 on the full expensing and get that in place. So a lot of folks right now are saying, regardless of what you do on an extension, is really be very, very aware of what might happen moving forward with this, because if they don't fix it over the summer, as John said, most likely the vehicle is going to be on the debt ceiling, and that right now doesn't look like it's going to hit possibly even until Labor Day. And if that's the case, you're going to be going 9 months past January 1 with still no answer on this. So be very careful on it. There's a lot of moving parts, and that's why what John said is so important to please contact your member of Congress. If you haven't gotten your spreadsheet from your CPA yet on what the amortization and capitalization means for you, you are going to be in for a shock. But John, you mentioned on the debt ceiling, the discussion started. I think McCarthy and went over to the White House and saw Biden a couple weeks ago.
And that's the first start of the discussions. It's going to a long period of time. We've technically exceeded the debt ceiling. However, the Department of Treasury is going through extraordinary circumstances, so we don't default on our debt. We are beginning to see small group discussions, bipartisan group discussions in the Congress on how to address the debt ceiling. The issue is Democrats want to pass a clean debt ceiling, meaning just raise the credit card limit. Republicans say, well, if we're gonna vote to raise the credit card limit, we want to see a reduction in government spending, and that is the crux of the challenge that's moving forward. And so one of the potential solutions, and it's more of a gimmick than a solution, is they can. Oh, and by the way, this Congressional Budget Office, the CBO last week came out and they did their analysis is when will they hit the hard debt ceiling limit, and they expected it sometime between July and September, meaning everybody in Washington's August recess, August vacation plans are now ruined because knowing Congress, they don't do anything to the last minute. But one of the gimmicks, solutions, outcomes that may happen is they may just do a temporary extension of the debt limit to tie the expiration of the debt limit to the end of the fiscal year, which would be September 30th. And so then you're not tying government cuts in government spending to the debt ceiling, you're tying funding of the federal government to the debt ceiling. It's, you know, two halves of the same thing, but it gives both sides, I think, cover to create a solution to address that debt ceiling. And the debt is so important. I mean, this next slide, I mean, our debt is not getting any, the national debt is not getting any smaller. And so many people on both sides recognize that, but how to address it, you know, there are Republicans who want to cut non-defense spending while Democrats want to cut defense spending. And that's the crux of the government spending. And that's why you see some of these budget projections so high.
Yeah, and I think the reason we walked you through this in the timeline is because we set it up by saying if you are going to get a fix on the R&D full expensing, it's likely going to be attached to this debt ceiling issue that is now potentially getting pushed. And strategically, it will be an important decision for them. And I do believe they ultimately will likely do this since they won't have a deal prior to leaving for recess in August on the debt ceiling. They are going to tether it to federal government spending would be my assumption, in large part because that will give Republicans further leverage in order to exact some of the spending cuts that they hope to see there. As you can see, we're running about a $1.4 trillion deficit right now. And then we can go from there. And please don't, this is my editorialing and I'll do it, but whatever you hear from politicians who say that they're going to cut all of these programs and they'll be able to balance budget, nonsense. None of that is actual true. You've got to do it on both sides. You've got to cut what you're spending and bring in more money, just as any of you know that runs a business. So that's really where you stand. But so some numbers that you need to know, we just mentioned on the tax side and regulatory, a few issues here. Wanted to clarify, and March is a very, very big month, whether you're dealing with semiconductors, Inflation Reduction Act, or any of the other tax provisions. The IRS and Treasury Department, Commerce, and NIST are all supposed to release some updates coming this month here. Most importantly, by now, most of you are aware that the Inflation Reduction Act, as John and I have reported in the past, provided a $7,500 tax credit for electric vehicle purchases, but had a number of limitations on there, primarily intended to encourage more domestic manufacturing here in the US. Ultimately, what it did, though, was anger a number of our European allies and then also cause some domestic automakers to say that they can't meet the 2025 target dates for some of the requirements that were put in place. So the Department of Treasury is delayed some of their battery criteria requirements for the domestic content until March, and that's when they're going to put out some additional information on what they deem as a free trade agreement. What we're hearing around town is that you will likely start increasingly seeing more targeted and narrow free trade agreements with Europe and potentially other allies, because the United States has written into law that the tax credits and the benefits there can also be extended to any country that also has an FTA. Europe and Japan do not have FTAs with the United States. And so that is an area where you could potentially see one. We're also hearing one potentially being looked at for semiconductors, downstream critical minerals as well. So they could potentially enter an agreement thereby allowing those types of critical inputs and goods to pass through back and forth across the borders. And you can see here it's a fact sheet they just put out a couple of weeks ago on February 3rd with additional information on the clean vehicle credit. We include this. Some of you might be buying it for your fleets, but also there might be those that are working on it as well for some of your OEMs, your suppliers, so you know that where that's going to end up as well. And then lastly, for turn it over to John on some OSHA issues here on 48C was another area of the guidance that Treasury issued. Also, they put out, there's things, they put out guidance, they put out notices, and they put out FAQs and fact sheets. They put out a guidance on 48C for the energy project credits. Some of you might be manufacturing components that might ultimately go into these projects. And so that's something to keep track of from a business development standpoint, that money is going to start flowing out, which ultimately theoretically would trickle into down and more orders. But John, as always, we want people to stay on top of their OSHA.
Yes, OSHA sent out a reminder for everybody that employers need to post their 300A in the facilities by April and must submit their 300A summary injury tracking application by March. Now, as we've mentioned in the past, you've got to do this online, and so don't wait till the last minute to complete this application, because it may take you some additional time that you haven't done in the past in submitting your some of these applications. OSHA is also looking at voluntary protection program. This is a safety program put forth by OSHA, and they're seeking input from employers on how best to address a voluntary protection program for employers, recognizing, you know, best practices in some industries and some businesses, and so they're seeking input there. For example, we know PMA in the past has been involved with the Department of Labor in their STAR program, and that is a comparable, not totally comparable, but a similar program where they reach out to industry to figure out what the best practices are and then promote them to other industries. And then on the heat rule, as we've talked about in the past, OSHA is considering coming up with new regulations where the heat index exceeds 80 degrees. Employers must take mitigating factors to address the heat index. 7 Democrat attorney generals from across the country appealed to OSHA and the president to file an emergency temporary standard on the heat index that would take effect on May 1. OSHA is continuing to move forward on developing the heat index, but we don't believe that a resolution will be done by May.
No, the attorneys general, what they were trying to do was get us on record ahead of the summer months. Obviously, this is usually what we do expect. OSHA has in the past, you can go online. They already have a OSHA heat awareness campaign, and they intend on ramping that up again here in the coming months. But right now, we're still waiting for what we call the SBREFA panel. That's the Small Business Regulatory Enforcement Flexibility Act. A panel that's supposed to be, when it comes together and is actually impaneled, is a 60-day review process, which means that they are not permitted to issue any rule or proposed rule or take any action until we complete that SBREFA panel, which we will be a part of. So they still haven't done that. They were supposed to do it back in January, but now that we've got the attorneys general trying to put additional pressure, what this is a precursor to them filing a lawsuit against OSHA and forcing them to act. And that will ultimately then, if OSHA does not move forward on the timeline that they see as appropriate down the line, that's probably what this is a precursor to that. Speaking of regulators and attorneys, Federal Trade Commission non-compete proposed rule that's out there. This is a couple things that are happening right now. The Federal Trade Commission is looking at restricting the use of private employers and the use of non-competes, which you all know what they are. But in addition to non-competes, because we know we've asked some of our members, some manufacturers do use them in C-suite, some of them use them elsewhere throughout their operations, engineers. But the non-disclosure agreements, if you go into the actual language of this FTC on the link there, they do reference NDAs quite a bit throughout that process, which many of you probably do have with your engineers, quality control, and other folks. There's a couple things in there. One of the languages says it's not to be excessive, or who determines what is excessive. So there's a lot of flexibility in there. I'm not an attorney. I would suggest looking at one, but the NDA clause in there, I would consider from your standpoint, a little bit more concerning in terms of what the ultimate outcome versus intended outcome is on the NDA versus the non-compete side. Those comments are due March 20th. It's sort of dividing some of Washington business community. Some people just don't use them at all. Others do, but keep that in mind. That's out there. One thing we wanted to flag, especially since we know that NTMA testified on this last summer, it is now up and running and still not fully populated the way that it needs to be, but at least we do have a website, manufacturing.gov. That was an act that President Biden signed into law as part of the larger omnibus spending bill in December. So thank you for Eric and everybody else that did the work on that to get that over the edge. If you believe it or not, there just was never a single place for you manufacturers to go to find out what programs and opportunities that are out there the federal government provides to benefit you. So this is going to take some time to still beef it up, and we will work with them on that as well, but just wanted to flag that that's out there. John, on the trade side, there's quite a bit, but let me just start with Paul pretty quickly, because we still have steel and aluminum tariffs that have not entirely left the radar screen here. Paul?
Yeah, our friend Mike Dankler, who went to the private sector, he worked for Jackie Warshawski. He's back with working in Congress, and he puts out an exclusions chart on a weekly basis. He doesn't have as much detail as he had before, but we're showing this chart just to show you that the number of steel and aluminum tariff exclusions requests, there's still a lot of them. And we want to hear from you because Commerce wants to hear from us regarding anybody's experience. I know that a lot of you buy your steel through Service Center, so you wouldn't necessarily be applying for the exclusions yourself, but just keep us posted if you are running into problems, and we are happy to convey those problems to the Commerce Department.
John, I'm about to write something up on this, but Mexico and US, not exactly the best of relationships right now, and you can see it coming from the Hill as well.
Yeah, the United States lost a domestic content case with Mexico, and it's part of the USMCA process. And now Mexican is being accused of transshipment of steel and aluminum into this country, and a bipartisan group of senators has sent a letter expressing concern about the surge in Mexican imports. And so this is an issue we got to keep watching. As we will see in another slide, there's a lot of nearshoring is taking place between China and Mexico, and so I think that's part of that input.
Yeah, and for those of you that are sourcing any metals coming in from Mexico, typically what this is going to be a precursor to the United States reinstating the Section 232 steel tariffs, which they're permitted to do under the agreement that they reached with the Canadians and Mexicans in 2019. So there's a provision in there that says after a period and then consultations, then the U.S. would be able to literally just snap back and put those tariffs in place. So that's something to keep in mind there. Ultimately, speculation, we do think that Mexico will probably take some steps or promise to take some steps with regards to the transshipment, but increasingly, as John mentioned, we're seeing the FDI into China really increase, particularly from China. So the transshipment won't be as relevant. It'll be more of lower in terms of the actual products that are coming from Mexico. Paul, right back to you. And we just saw that we do have 200% tariff now on aluminum coming in from Russia, but here's your steel prices slide.
Yeah, so steel prices are inching back up. Argus, which is a trade publication that follows steel prices and steel market closely, has been in touch with us and wants to hear what's going on. While the gap between U.S. steel prices and China and the EU have narrowed significantly from where they were a year ago, there's been steel prices in general are on the rise, with Nucor announcing new price hikes, and it'll be interesting to see, and we want to hear from you on what's happening. What's your experience in your purchase of steel and aluminum? As Omar said, the U.S. has put large tariffs on Russian aluminum. By the way, today is the 1-year anniversary, as many of you know, of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where additional sanctions on Russian individuals and are being announced by the Biden administration. They just put them out in the last hour. So don't expect a lot to become anything coming out of Russia that is going to be used in the United States, because they are very much putting the cracking down on the Russians even more. And the announcement today is I think they put about 200 more individuals on the sanctions list.
Yeah, and we've been talking to some other manufacturers as well on titanium and the concerns in some of that market, in addition to other areas. Copper is still a problem, but we've been hearing on titanium specifically with regards to Russia and some aerospace and how that's going to be made whole somehow, somewhere. Just a few general here as we get ready to wrap up. As always, please enter in to anything you've got here onto the right-hand box. You can type in your questions there. That would be helpful. We'll be able to answer in about 2 or 3 slides here. Manufacturing output. You still hear a lot of folks, are we going into a recession? Are we not? We're still hearing from many of you all that we're busy, that you still have orders coming in. Many folks saying they're still booked and have bookings into the next summer. So these are just some general numbers that we thought we would throw out there that you all can review later and compare to see what you all are seeing internally. And then US factory production, looking at the large increase. So obviously just go to that line that's up, not the bottom line, but the one where you've got the bars going up and down, and you can see how you're seeing the total industrial output in the month over month that's actually increased in some areas recently. And that's a winter month increase, which is not as typical as you would normally see in other areas, as you can look at the previous Januaries from other years as well. But John, as you mentioned, this is something that we've been talking about for some time, especially after the new NAFTA was negotiated by such terms as we believe that were quite favorable once the U.S. got out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. So do expect to see more and more in the news about investments in Mexico with regards to shipping into the North American market.
Yeah, the way Mexico sets it up, they've got these industrial parks set up, and their industrial parks have grown 30%. And this is and we're seeing it from transshipments, primarily coming from China. And when you look at those industrial parks that have grown by 30%, they're at 97% capacity. And so this nearshoring is taking effect. Jobs are being created, production is increasing in Mexico. And so as a result, the Mexican government is planning on expanding these industrial parks to address this issue. And so I think there is a long-term potential impact on the relationship between the United States and Mexico over transshipments and goods coming into Mexico from other parts of the world that eventually comes to the United States.
Yeah, that's right. And Paul, as we get ready to wrap up here, why don't you take us out on some of the surveys?
Sure. So we're starting to create some graphics for the One Voice survey that was put out in January. It's a great visual tool to let folks know about what you're all concerned about. You know, as we talk about the One Voice survey, really guides the issue areas that we focus on. On the right-hand side there, you see that the top 3 policy issues that you wanted us to focus on were workforce, taxes, raw material prices, all of which we've talked about in this presentation. And we do want to emphasize, and we'll be putting out some more graphics that we'll be using on social media and, you know, giving to John and Omar to use as they talk to members of Congress and the administration on the challenges of workforce, you know, what you're going through regarding trying to recruit folks and to hire people. So very interesting results on that, you know, as you can see, 92% of you said, of those who responded, NTMA and PMA members said you have job openings, and 50% of you said you have multiple job openings, and 95% of the companies say that you are experiencing challenges recruiting qualified employees. And be interesting to talk to those 5% and see what their secret is. And then one more, I wanted to point out that Jeff Asnavorian talked to the Washington Post. They were doing kind of a curtain raiser on the State of the Union about what business is seeing out there for the economy. This reporter, David Lynch, contacted me. We've worked with him in the past. He's highlighted other NTMA and PMA members. Jeff's a PMA member. And he was up there with some very large companies in the article. They quoted 2 or 3 CEOs and heads of their companies. And so it's a great way for us to continue to influence what's going on Capitol Hill. I know Omar and John take this and they pass along these articles to their to members of Congress and use in their meetings. As we were talking, I just got a call from the Wall Street Journal about something that I will call them back, but that's a reminder that both NTMA and PMA have volunteer forms. If you want to speak to the media, it's a great way to promote your company. We'll always vet any calls that we get and work with you. We could always use the help. They want to talk to you more than they want to talk to me because you're out there hiring people and seeing what's out there and creating jobs. So you can contact your associations and they will contact me. And always, we have a great podcast out there, One Voice, Talking with One Voice. So please download the latest episode. It's available wherever you get your podcasts. And if you don't listen to podcasts, come on, you know, that's the future. So, you know, suck it up and look at your Apple podcast app and listen to a couple of them.
Actually, that last podcast, we spent a lot of time talking about the R&D tax credit, bonus appreciation, and debt ceiling, which is basically more discussion about what we talked about earlier today.
Yeah, absolutely. And please do what you can to support your advocacy program. That's how we bring you this once a month and 30-minute blocks. Please contact your association. Happy to help you in anything that we have not discussed here today. Please type in any questions here as we get ready to wrap up. We do have one question in the queue, again, in your right-hand spot. This says questions. Please type it right in there. Happy to answer it if we can. It's an insightful one. I like this one. What is the first trade legislation likely to move through Finance and Ways and Means committees? Will it possibly pass both chambers? When may a floor vote happen? What I'm hearing, at least from my side, yeah, I like this question. This is like my wheelhouse. What I'm hearing is we're probably going to be looking at maybe some kind of a customs reform legislation. The last major customs action that we had was what we call the Enforce Act, and that was now about 8 years ago, 7, 8 years ago. It was still during, it would have been, I don't know, 8 to 10 years ago. It was under Obama. And when Ron Wyden was running the show on that one. So we haven't had that in a while. Really, you haven't touched customs in 40 years. So the trade community is starting to increasingly talk about that. And if we do have a customs bill start to come together over the summer, that would likely be the vehicle for additional trade legislation that people have been throwing around town, whether it's that tightens up some of the anti-dumping countervailing duties, whether it's TAA, trade adjustment assistance for firms and for workers to be included into that. There's a number of areas, including that we've been working on fixing the 232 national security definitions with regard to steel and aluminum tariffs. It's difficult right now to get trade issues through Congress because you're going to see most of the emphasis be on China. To John's point earlier, there is certainly unity on going after China. The question is, what do you do once you get there? John mentioned also that is not a standing committee in the House. It's a select committee, which means they will not be advancing legislation, but they will be promoting ideas. The next wave of China focused is more going to be on technology transfers and restricting the tech race moving forward between the two countries, following up on tightening up on the CHIPS Act. But trade legislation, if we see anything, it's most likely going to be customs focused based on conversations we're having, and that likely will be looking at a July timeframe is what I'm hearing.
I agree with you, Omar. I think there's the trade policy arena has been neglected for a number of years, and the Congress is backed up on trade issues that need to be addressed, that Omar pointed out. But there's also what I would call trade fatigue. It's issues that are in the weeds that members of Congress really need to learn the details of it. And trade policy is a very controversial, very partisan issue. And that's why I don't think there hasn't been consensus around trade policy, which is why nothing has moved in recent years.
Yeah,
very little has moved in recent years.
Yeah, I do think you will get an enforcement bill this year. There is talk in the Senate about free trade agreements again. That's not going to happen. Biden is not going to do a full-scale free trade agreement. They will get something limited. They're going to get a strategic partnership done with Kenya. That's in the works. It'll get more substantive over the summer, and they'll finalize that for the end of the year, hopefully. And then you'll move forward with EU and Japan in some form, and those you might see some votes on, again, targeted free trade agreements that are looking at strategic supply chains, whether it's chips or other critical raw materials, EVs, those kinds of areas. So that likely will happen at some point as well. But you're not going to get big old trade omnibus bills like you did about a decade ago again.
Yeah, I think there's very little space between the Biden trade policy and the Trump trade policies. I think the rhetoric is a little different and a little toned down, but if you look at the substance of it, there hasn't been a great deal of change. And Ambassador Tai, the U.S. trade representative, really, her criticisms of WTO and of her defense of tariffs, it could be any USTR rep under the Trump administration, I think, could have said the same thing.
Thanks for the question, Scott. Sorry for the long answer. That's what you get for asking us something we work on very, very closely and often. Any other questions? I know we ran a little bit over today. Doesn't look like it. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Until next one, let us know, as always, if you have any questions. Our contact information is on the slide. Thank you and enjoy your weekend.